It was an ordinary day at one of the many stores in the chain. The bright fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the soft hum of the air conditioner could barely be heard above the gentle chatter of customers. The store manager, Robert, stood behind the counter, his arms crossed as he surveyed the floor. He had a look of discontent, like something about the day was just off. A customer walked in, tall, dressed in a sharp suit, with a presence that seemed to command attention. Robert didn't think much of it at first. He had seen all kinds of people walk through those doors. But this one was different. He immediately noticed something that irked him. This man was black. Robert wasn't proud of the judgment that came to his mind, but he couldn't help it. He had certain ideas about people, and they were all too familiar to him. The man, confident yet quiet, made his way toward the back of the store, carefully inspecting the products. Robert watched him with a skeptical eye. His heart began to race as he thought about the possibility of this man causing trouble, something he had seen before with people he didn't deem fit for his store. But when the man approached the counter, Robert's discomfort turned into something else entirely. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to end well. "Can I help you, sir?" Robert asked, his voice cold and dismissive. The man smiled politely. "Yes, I'm just looking for a few things for my office," he said in a calm tone, completely unaware of the judgment forming in Robert's mind. Robert couldn't let go of his assumptions. His eyes narrowed as he watched the man place a few items on the counter. Something inside him snapped. Without thinking, Robert reached for the phone. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm going to need to ask you to leave," Robert said, his voice sharp now, though there was a hidden tremor of unease beneath the words. "You're not welcome here." The man froze. His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a mixture of surprise and disbelief. He opened his mouth, ready to ask why, but Robert cut him off. "I'm calling the police," he said coldly, pressing the digits into the phone. "You're causing trouble, and I can't have that in my store." The man didn't react the way Robert had expected. He didn't yell, didn't argue. He simply stood there, calm as ever. The manager's grip tightened around the phone, his nerves running high. He didn't know what he expected to happen next, but he couldn't back down now. He had made up his mind. And so, with a deep breath, he hit the final number. The call was made. The ringing of the phone seemed to echo through the store, drowning out everything else. Robert could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his chest, as though the world around him had suddenly slowed down. The man still standing by the counter didn't move. His eyes locked on Robert's, but he didn't say a word. It was like the entire room was waiting for something big. As the phone continued to ring, Robert's hands started to sweat. He told himself he was in control. He was doing the right thing. The man had been acting suspicious after all, right? Robert had worked in retail for years and knew how to spot troublemakers. This man's appearance, his demeanor, it just didn't fit. Finally, the phone clicked, and a voice on the other end came through. 911, what's your emergency?" Robert didn't waste a second. His words spilled out quickly, fueled by a mix of frustration and anxiety. "I've got a customer in here causing problems. He's refusing to leave, and I think he's planning to steal something. I need an officer here now." The dispatcher didn't hesitate. "We'll send someone over right away. Stay on the line." Robert hung up before they could finish the conversation. He didn't need to say any more. The man was still standing there, unmoving. It felt like an eternity before Robert dared to glance up at him again. The man didn't look angry. He didn't look scared. He just looked tired, as if he had seen this kind of thing before. And something about that look made Robert's stomach turn. He quickly shoved the feeling down, trying to convince himself he was in the right. He crossed his arms tighter, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You should have just left when I asked," Robert muttered, almost to himself. The man didn't respond immediately, and when he finally did, his voice was calm, almost too calm. "I don't think I'm the one causing problems here." Robert flinched at the words, but before he could respond, the front door opened with a jingle, and 2 police officers stepped inside. The officers walked in, their boots clicking against the tile floor, their presence commanding attention. Robert quickly pointed at the man. "There he is, officers," Robert said, trying to sound confident, but the words didn't come out as forcefully as he intended. He couldn't help the slight tremor in his voice, a reminder of how uncertain he suddenly felt. "I asked him to leave, but he refused." The officers glanced at each other, then turned their attention to the man. He was standing still, not defensive, but still, as if waiting for something to happen. "Sir, are you the one causing trouble here?" one of the officers asked, his voice firm. The man smiled, but it wasn't a smile of humor. It was calm, almost sad. "No, officer, I'm not causing trouble, but I think your friend behind the counter might have some explaining to do." Robert's brow furrowed, a little irritated by the man's calm demeanor. He had expected resistance, but not this quiet confidence. He wasn't sure what the man meant, but the thought made him uneasy. The officer, sensing the tension, took a step closer to the man. "Sir, we'll need to check your ID, and then we can sort this out." "No need," the man replied smoothly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a wallet. He handed it over without a word. The officer opened the wallet and scanned the ID inside, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the details. The silence in the store grew heavy. Robert couldn't understand what was happening. The officer didn't seem angry, but his expression had changed. There was something in his gaze now, something that made Robert's stomach twist. Sir," the officer stammered, looking up from the ID. I'm sorry for the confusion, but we may need to speak with your manager." Robert's heart dropped to his stomach. "What do you mean? What's going on?" The officer glanced at Robert, then back at the man. "Sir," he said, addressing the customer, "I'm afraid you're going to have to clear this up with your manager. There's been a mistake." The man nodded, a quiet acceptance in his eyes, but there was a sense of power in his gaze now, something Robert couldn't quite put his finger on. "What's the issue?" Robert demanded, his voice now laced with confusion and panic. The officer turned to him. "You don't know who this man is, do you?" Robert was about to speak, but he stopped himself. He had no idea what was going on, and for the first time, the fear inside him started to grow. He took a step back, unsure of what to say. The officers were now standing with the man, not as if he were a suspect, but almost like they were trying to calm him. Finally, the man spoke again, his voice still steady, but now there was an unmistakable hint of authority in it. "I think it's time you found out who I am." The store fell silent, the air heavy with tension. Robert's mind raced, but he couldn't make sense of anything. The officers were no longer looking at the man with suspicion, but with something else, respect, maybe even awe. Robert's throat tightened as the man's calm, steady voice filled the room. "Robert," the man began, his gaze unwavering, "I own this entire chain of stores, every single one of them." The words hit Robert like a punch to the gut. For a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't process what he had just heard. He blinked, trying to find some way to reconcile this new information with the reality of what had just unfolded. "You... what?" Robert managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. His eyes darted between the officers and the man, but all he saw was the same calm, unbothered demeanor in the customer's eyes. The officers exchanged a glance, and one of them took a small step back, almost as if giving Robert space to digest what had just been said. The other officer's expression remained neutral, but the man's presence seemed to cast a long shadow over the room. "I'm sorry," Robert stammered, his voice rising slightly. "But this doesn't make any sense. I don't believe you." The man reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a business card, handing it to the officer. The officer took it with a nod and read it silently, his face unreadable. After a few moments, he glanced at Robert. "Everything checks out," the officer said softly, his tone almost apologetic. "This man is the CEO of the entire chain." Robert's face turned white as the full weight of the situation hit him. The man wasn't just a customer. He was the very person who had built this empire, the one who owned everything Robert had ever worked for. Why, why didn't you say something sooner? Robert blurted out, his confusion turning into a defensive panic. He couldn't believe what was happening. His heart was racing now, and his mind was scrambling to make sense of it all. He had been so sure that this man didn't belong in his store, that he had been a threat, but now— I didn't think I needed to, the man replied, his voice calm but firm. But I'm guessing you didn't care to find out who I really was before you made your call. Robert could feel his face redden, the heat of shame flooding his body. His mouth went dry, and his mind struggled to come up with any sort of excuse for his actions. But there was no excuse. He had judged this man based on nothing but his own biases, his own prejudices. And now, standing in front of him was the very person who had the power to change everything he knew. The officers didn't say anything else, but their presence made it clear. They were waiting for Robert to say something, anything. But what could he say? "I'm sorry," Robert muttered, his voice barely audible. His head hung low, his shoulders slumped with the weight of the reality that had just unfolded. I didn't know. I made a mistake." The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Robert's face. There was no anger, no bitterness in his gaze, just a quiet, steady look that seemed to hold all the power of the moment. "You didn't," the man said, his voice soft but unyielding. "But now you know. And I hope you remember this moment the next time you make assumptions about someone." The room felt suffocating, like the air itself had thickened with the weight of Robert's mistake. Every heartbeat sounded too loud in his ears, and every glance from the officers only deepened his sense of humiliation. His eyes couldn't meet the man's any longer. Instead, he stared down at the counter, his fingers nervously tapping against the cold surface. What was there left to say? The silence stretched on, unbearable and thick. It was the kind of silence that made you question every decision you'd ever made, every action you'd ever taken. And Robert knew, he knew, that this moment would follow him forever. The embarrassment wasn't just about being wrong. It was about how he had let his own biases dictate his actions, how he had judged someone based purely on the color of their skin and his own assumptions about who they should be. After a long pause, the man spoke again, his voice surprisingly gentle, but still carrying that quiet authority that had been with him the whole time. "Robert," he said, drawing the manager's attention back to him. "I could have you fired right now. It wouldn't be hard. You've broken company policies, and frankly, you've made a mockery of the values we stand for." Robert's throat tightened. His hands began to shake, but he held them in his lap, trying to control himself. The thought of losing his job, of everything he had worked for, was almost too much to bear. His mind raced, but there were no words left to defend himself. What could he say? The man continued, his tone still calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "But I'm not going to do that." Robert looked up, finally meeting the man's gaze. "You're not?" "No," the man replied, his eyes unwavering. "I don't believe in revenge, but I do believe in change, and maybe this is the lesson you need." The words hit Robert harder than anything else. Change. He needed to change. The truth was staring him in the face now, and he couldn't deny it anymore. His actions had consequences, deep ones. And maybe this moment, as painful as it was the turning point. "I want you to understand something," the man said, his voice softening just slightly. "This isn't about a mistake. This is about the system you're a part of, the way we, as people, can make judgments based on things that have nothing to do with who someone really is." Robert nodded, but it was as if his entire body had gone numb. The man wasn't speaking just to him. He was speaking to something much bigger, something Robert hadn't even fully realized until now. His world had been built on assumptions, on the idea that some people were worth more than others, that people like him deserved more respect than people like the man standing before him. I don't know what to say," Robert whispered. The apology felt empty, but it was all he had. He felt so small in that moment, so insignificant in the face of this man's quiet strength and wisdom. You don't need to say anything, the man replied. Just think about what you've done, and if you really want to change, then do the work. It's not easy, but it's necessary. The officers, who had been standing back watching the exchange, finally stepped forward. Sir, one of them said, looking at Robert, we're going to take a statement, but there won't be any charges. Just let this be a learning experience for everyone. The man nodded, then turned to Robert one last time. You'll be fine, but the question is, what kind of person are you going to be moving forward? The man didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he turned and walked out of the store, his calm steps echoing in the silence he left behind. Robert stood there for a long time after, staring at the door, feeling the weight of the lessons sinking deeper into his bones. The store was eerily quiet after the man left, and Robert stood frozen for what felt like an eternity. The officers, having taken their statements, gave him one last look before they exited the store as well, leaving him alone with his thoughts. His mind was reeling, a mix of guilt, confusion, and shame. The man had left him with no clear path, just a challenge. A challenge to reflect, to change, to do better. But how? How could he undo the damage he had already done? He moved to the counter, running a shaky hand through his hair. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, but he didn't recognize the person he saw. His own face seemed foreign now. The man's words kept echoing in his head. What kind of person are you going to be moving forward? A heavy sigh escaped his lips, and he walked to the back of the store, his footsteps feeling hollow, as though the weight of his actions had become too much to bear. He didn't know how to fix it. The man had owned up to his mistakes without hesitation, but Robert felt like he had nowhere to turn. But as he stood in the break room, leaning against the counter, he began to feel something shift inside him. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe he could change. The next morning, Robert returned to work with a new sense of purpose, or at least a desire to try. The usual rush of customers came in, and he greeted them with a different mindset. No longer did he make assumptions about who they were, based on their clothes, their skin color, or their demeanor. Every person was a person, deserving of respect. It was a slow, difficult process, but every day, he worked at it. A few weeks later, Robert received a letter at the store. It was from the man, the CEO. The letter wasn't threatening or scolding. Instead, it was an invitation. He wanted to meet with Robert. He wanted him to come to the headquarters and discuss what had happened. The letter was an offer of mentorship, of guidance. It was a chance for Robert to understand the company's deeper values, to grow beyond his past mistakes. Robert's hands trembled as he read the letter. The opportunity to learn, to make things right, it was more than he ever expected. It felt like a lifeline. When he met with the man, face to face this time, he could feel the sincerity in his presence. The man didn't hold a grudge. Instead, he spoke with patience and wisdom, sharing stories of his own struggles, his own growth, and the lessons he had learned. He didn't see Robert as a failure, but as someone capable of change. As the weeks turned into months, Robert began to understand the true meaning of leadership. It wasn't about power or control or making snap judgments. It was about understanding, compassion, and the willingness to see people for who they truly were, not who you thought they should be. And slowly, bit by bit, Robert found himself changing, not just on the outside, but deep within. He learned to listen, to reflect, to challenge his own biases. It wasn't easy, but every step forward felt like a victory. Years later, Robert would look back on that day, the day he nearly lost everything, and realize it was the turning point of his life. The day that man walked into the store wasn't just about a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was about the possibility of redemption, about the power to change when given the chance. And for that, Robert would be forever grateful.